Ya şu videoyu izleyecektik, evet.
Historically, Sony have always followed their main PlayStation console launches with slimmer versions about 3 to 4 years after their initial release. As their latest console, the PS5, is literally their largest ever,
Harbiden,
a
bu
slim version
PlayStation'da
is sorely needed. But as
ben bu PlayStation'ı dik koyamıyorum salona. Televizyon yönetime dik koyarsam bu PlayStation televizyonu göremiyorum. Sol altı yok oluyor. Gözükmüyor direkt.
it's so new, I think it's unfortunately going to be a while yet until we see a more compact version. However, I think it's going to be possible to make the present version slimmer. How slim? That slim? Maybe that slim? How about 2 centimeters? And for context, that's a fraction more than the thickness of a DVD. As we discovered in my previous PS5 videos, stripping away its casing to get to the internal components is relatively straightforward, leaving us with the PS5's
Yok oğlum, PlayStation 5 çok büyük ama ya. Harbiden yani.
As you can see, the power supply alone takes up quite a bit of space, and I'm really not sure what options I have to make it smaller yet, so I'm going to brush it under the rug to deal with later. Focusing on the main motherboard.
Çok iyi duruyor. Durmuyor işte bence. Durmuyor arkadaşlar. Yani fiziksel olarak gördüğünüzde fikriniz çok değişiyor. Çok büyük. Çok büyük. Rahatsız edici. Burj Khalifa gibi yani. Salonun ortasına birisi şey yapmış gibi. Ormanı yakmış, AVM çekmiş gibi duruyor.
The scale of the challenge remains, as this alone still measures about 5.5 centimeters thick, which is just over 2 inches. Remember, my target is 2 centimeters, so I've got
laptoptan daha
quite a
büyük.
way to
Tabii
go.
laptoptan kat
But
daha büyük oğlum.
most of this thickness comes from the cooling heatsink, which has given me an idea, though one that requires us to go deeper still. Off it comes. As you can see, the heatsink makes contact with the main processor, in this case an SoC, to cool it, as this is where the majority of the heat comes from. It's a lot of heat as well.
Ya şöyle söyleyeyim, PlayStation 4'ün 5'in büyüklüğü 4-5 tane gaming laptopu yan yana koyduğundaki büyüklük. Bayağı büyük. Yani görmediyseniz fiziksel olarak fotoğraflardan çok anlaşılmıyor. Bayağı büyük PlayStation 5. Maşallah var.
100 watts. That's as much as a slow cooker on high heat.
Ha, bu arada şöyle bir şey var. Hem bu kadar laf yapıyorum ama konsolun büyük olmasını tercih ederim ses çıkarmaksındansa. Yani net bir şekilde PlayStation 4 gibi uçak kaldırmasındansa ısınmamasını tercih ederim. Onu da söyleyeyim. Hani eğer çözümleri buysa, diğer türlü yapamadılarsa da buna da okeyim. Ağlamam. Daha iyi çalışsın, daha iyi grafik olsun. Daha az ses çıkarsın. Kafi, okey.
Tiny surface area. This is presumably why Sony have opted to use a liquid metal to act as a thermal bridge between the SoC and the heatsink, as it's much more effective at transferring heat than traditional thermal pastes. As it's conductive to electricity as well though, I'll have to clean it off for now so that it doesn't spill onto any surrounding components in the meantime. Shiny.
Büyük. 5 tane derken götüne sıkmıyorum. Yani gövdemi kaplıyor arkadaşlar. Yani büyük. Yani yok yani küçük değil. Yani maşallah var arkadaşlar bu konsolun. Yani dev. Baksana alt taraftan. Çonk. Hani harbiden damacana force scale atıyorsun.
So with the steel shrouding and heatsink removed, things are looking a bit more promising, as the motherboard itself is
Dijital sürüm daha güzel. Kesinlikle
We're
katılıyorum.
not out of the woods yet though, because turning it on in this state would mean that it would obviously just instantly overheat and die. So we need to figure out a way of dealing with all of this heat, but in a much slimmer form factor. We can look towards desktop computers for some inspiration for this.
Türkiye dijital sürüm geldi de 3 çok az geldi. Ve direkt bitti.
As a common
Başar
compact way
Türk ve
to
18
cool
yaşın
down processes
canımsın. En iyi
effectively
abonem, hoş
is to
geldin.
use water cooling blocks. These are simply mounted on top of heat generating
Oldu.
components,
Aç şimdi
allowing
PC.
water to be pumped through them
Suya
to
gerek
whip
yok.
away the heat. While they are much smaller than heat sinks, this
Oldu.
advantage
Aç.
diminishes somewhat when the tubing is attached, as even when bent over, almost 6 centimeters of headroom is still required, with right angle fittings not improving matters either. So, a little creativity is in order. You see, while the top part of the water block is an important functional component of it, it's actually the copper base plate that does most of the heavy lifting. This has many small channels cut into it to increase the surface area in contact with water at any one time, drastically improving thermal transfer. As you can see, this in itself is pretty thin, and so long as we can get water to and from it effectively, we might be in with a chance here. So my plan is to build a custom water channeling system with a new material for me, copper sheeting. Sorry, brass. I've got 3 thicknesses here in order to make a copper sandwich, with the middle layer being the thickest at 3 millimeters. For some reason, copper in sheet form is ridiculously expensive, and these sheets alone cost almost as much as the PS5 itself. So a big thank you to my Patreon supporters who donate to the channel to keep me making these crazy projects. You guys rock. Now the first step in making this custom channeling is to trim down the first layer with a slot to fit around the various ports. Well, we've already hit our first snag. The power connector that fits into the power supply is rather tall, so that needs to go.
Hadi bakalım. Sökmeye başladık.
Much better. Now it's vitally important that the cooling block touches the PS5 processor directly, which means that it's necessary to cut out a hole for it in this first layer, refining it to the correct shape with a file. Despite this, the rather thick rim of the block still pushes the fins too far away, preventing them from being flush with the rest of the copper. So it's time for some more cutting. No going back.
Oh no.
Perfect.
Damn, ne güzel oturdu harbiden.
There are 3 components that still impact this layer, stopping it from lying flat, but they can be dealt with by drilling a few holes. Speaking of holes, now that this layer does lie flat, it's possible to mark where the motherboard mounting holes are in order to add some brass pillar supports for them. That these are brass is not a coincidence. They need to be made watertight, and to do this I'm going to solder them to the copper itself with a blowtorch.
Blowtorch biraz abartı değil mi usta?
These have thankfully ended up accurate enough for the motherboard to rest on them fairly loosely, meaning that there shouldn't be any pressure when it's screwed on properly later. Now, in order to direct the water from the intake to the cooling block and then round and out again, we're going to bring into play the middle copper layer, which, if you remember, is twice as thick at 3 millimeters. The water channel is going to be cut from this, with the path I've sketched out following the same route, in through a hole to the cooling block and then around and out again. Now, the reason why I'm utilising layers to make these channels is exemplified here, which is solely
Çok
that
merak
it
ediyorum
doesn't
nasıl
need
yapacak.
any fancy equipment or CNC routers to make them. Just a good old
Not fancy equipments. Türkiye'de bu 6000 filan.
jigsaw with a metal blade attached. I also need to make a much smaller channel adjacent to the larger one, which will be for cooling an additional component that I'll be tackling later. So here we have the finished article. When it's mounted
Tabii
to the
fancy
third
değil
layer, which
harbiden.
will simply be
Ama
a blank
yine
lid,
de.
water will be pumped over the CPU, round and out again, with a small amount of water entering the micro channel, in and out. So we've now reached a pivotal moment in this project, which is to solder these layers together to make them a single watertight chamber that can then in turn hopefully cool the PS5. Now my original plan for this was to simply use the blowtorch, but thinking about it, the actual heat output of this is very focused, which means as I heat up an area, another area is just going to cool down. And I don't think that this thing has enough power for it to heat the whole thing if I were to move the flame over it rapidly. So I need an alternative plan. And this comes in
almış Devat çıksa ve 2500 lira. Vergi yanıtıyorsun. 4000 5000.
form of a little oven. Now my thinking here is to tin the individual layers, put them in the oven, which will hopefully heat them up enough to melt the solder, welding them together. But I'm not actually sure whether this thing can get hot enough yet, so let's start with some tests.
Patlayacak bir
The
şey.
first thing I'm going to do here is prepare 2 pieces of copper by tinning them with some solder, and then some crocodile clips can be used to clamp them together. These put a constant squeezing pressure against both sides, which should be helpful when the solder melts.
Ben de bu
Now,
yönteme
it's
çok
worth noting
güvenemedim.
that I've bought this oven specifically for this project, and it will not be used for food here on out, because the solder fumes can be pretty nasty. Anyway, after about 15 minutes, the bit of solder on top suddenly melts, which means that the oven
Fırına
does
koyuyor.
indeed get hot enough. How about the
Ya
strips?
Tuzson, çok bol 33
Well, now
milyon
they're
5. canım
cool, I
sızdın.
can
En
break
iyi
them
abonemsin, hoş
apart,
geldin.
but we can see that the solder has definitely fully melted between them as well. So this method definitely has a chance
Ay,
of
çok
working.
rahat ayırdın
so it's
ya.
time for the real deal. This again requires
Ustam,
the layers
çok
to be
rahat
tinned on
ayırmadın
both
mı?
sides before putting crocodile clips around the perimeter. As you may have noticed, I'm doing the bottom and middle layers
Oh no,
first,
çok
just
darbe
in case
çatma.
something goes wrong.
Mikrodalga değil, fırın.
But success. It's a bit gooey from the flux, but the 2 layers are definitely joined together now. One thing I realised though is that it would have been
Evet,
all
çünkü
too
öyle.
easy for the
demek
mini
istiyorsun?
channel to have filled up with solder, which would have blocked it. So to protect it from the next batch of soldering, I'm filling it with a type of silicone grease. I've had this stuff for years as a cheap thermal paste, but from my experiments it resists these temperatures well enough, and more importantly it dissolves in alcohol, so it should be easy to remove afterwards. As the middle isn't being squeezed by the crocodile
Biraz fazla
clips, I'm
değil,
wedging in
neyse.
some metal to provide some central pressure.
Çok derme çatma bu arada.
And there we have it. One custom PS5 water block
Çok
made with hand
enteresan
tools. And as
yaptı
you can
ya.
see, it
Yaptı
now
bu arada.
features some barbed inlet and outlet
Yani
ports,
teknik
which I
olarak
soldered
harbiden
in place
yaptı.
separately for attaching some tubing later. To get the grease out, I'm using a syringe to force it out with the alcohol. As I've bunged up the main channel, it has nowhere to go but through the small channel, which is why it's very stubborn. But after soaking it for a few hours, it finally bursts free.
Şey yapıyor bu
This
arada.
needs to be done several
Bir
times
silikonla
before-
doldurdu. O silikonla doldurmasının sebebi koyduğu lehimle dolmasın o aralık. Silikonu alkol göndererek sonra eritiyor. Çıkartıyor.
All the alcohol runs clear, after which I can follow it up with a diluted acid mix to clear out any of the remaining flux from the inside with the help of a water pump. Now, as you can see, there is one part conspicuously missing here, which is the cooling block. I've left it out until now, again for fear of the channels getting filled with solder, and I'm using the last of the grease to jam
Maşallah.
these full of it to hopefully
Ustam.
prevent solder from taking its place. And again, once all of the grease and gunk has been cleared out, it's the moment of truth. Is it watertight? Yes! Mission accomplished. Okay,
O
so
adam
with this
harbiden
soldered up, I'm actually feeling really good about this project.
su
because
kaçırmayan
not
bir şey
only do we
yaptı.
know that this is now airtight, which in turn makes it watertight as well, but I'm also fairly confident that the water block itself hasn't filled with solder. If it had, it would have been
Büyük
game
başarı
over,
lan.
so I'm very happy about that.
Yapış tarzı çok enteresandı.
Extremely messy and not very presentable. So I think we need to give this a polish, and then we can fit the PS5 into it. So let's go.
Oğlum çok güzel
I'm not
yaptı
going for
ya.
a pristine finish here, as it's really only an internal component and won't ever be seen. But even so, it's turned up
Evet,
looking
yani
pretty cool.
fırın kullanarak
Before I can
yaptı
mount the motherboard
sadece.
in place, though, there are a few additional thermal bridges that need to be
Dem
made.
harbiden.
You see, on the original cooling system, the steel plate made contact with a few secondary heat generating components,
alt
namely
taraflar.
some flash storage and some power circuitry. Making sure that these components get access to the cooling ability of the water block will ensure that they're kept as cool as what they were designed for, maybe even cooler. And to do this, I'm simply using some copper strips and thermal glue, with the accompanying components receiving standard thermal paste to prepare them for mounting. As for the SoC, that needs a new coating of liquid metal for better thermal bridging. And to prevent overspill, I'm tracing its perimeter
Ama
with
ısınırsa
putty to
ayrılmaz mı?
seal around it. Much
Ya
like on the
ısınırsa tabii ayrılır ama o kadar ısınması lazım. Çok ısınması lazım. Yani fırın kadar ısınır mı emin değilim.
original heatsink, with the same being
Ama bilmiyorum işte dediğim gibi ısınabilir belli de olmaz. PlayStation operating temperature'ını bilmek lazım.
brackets to put downward pressure on the back of the processor. And in addition to that, there are some components on this side of the board that also need some thermal bridging, though this time to a lid that I've not made yet. These aren't particularly power-hungry components, so having the heat dissipated to a lid should be quite adequate for them. But this isn't the case at all for the VRMs, which are in a row right here. These regulate the power input, and as a result, they generate too much heat to be dealt with passively by the lid. On the original PS5, Sony kept them cool by using a heat pipe to link them to a small heatsink. A heat pipe, for those who don't know, isn't just a rod of copper, but is actually hollow with a wick covering the internal surface. As there's a liquid inside that has a low boiling point, this liquid evaporates from the wick whenever heat is applied and then moves as a vapour to cooler areas where it condenses again before soaking back into the wick where the process starts
Ustam teknoloji çok güzel bir şey.
This moves heat rapidly and effectively, but the shape of the original won't fit my new design, so I'm going to have to make my own. Thankfully, it's fairly easy to buy brand new heat pipes online, and after warming it up, it's possible to bend it fairly easily into the required shape. What's not so easy, however, is soldering heat pipes to anything, as if you heat them up too much, they can explode. Cooling one side with a damp cloth, though, worked for me, and I was able to mount it to the original copper spreader. All this, by the way, is what the additional mini water channel is for, as it cools a stack of copper, which in turn cools the heat pipe.
Kontak bilmiyorum dedim. Denemem lazım. Yani uzaktan yardım edemem ne yazık ki.
But there's a big problem that could spoil the party. Where's the power supply going to go? As you've seen already, it's kind of big and a bit
yani
weird.
Power supply'ı bile Xbox One'ın ilk orijinal hali gibi yaparız. Koy dışarıya ustam. Dışarıya koy.
The question, where have Sony put the power supply in their past slimline consoles? Well, in the past two PlayStation Slim releases, they drastically lowered the console's overall power consumption, which meant that their internal power supplies could be much smaller, though capable of delivering far less power. Unfortunately for us, there's no way we can reduce the PS5's overall power requirement to allow the use of these smaller power supplies. But there is still one option we can explore which Sony and other console makers have resorted to in the past, making the power supply external. Both the PS1 and PS2 Slim offloaded power to an external power brick to make them smaller, a strategy also used in several Xbox consoles.
Yemin ediyorum şu adam öldürür. Bu cidden adam öldürürdü. Yani bu yemin ediyorum Switch'ten daha büyük. Atsan adamın kafasını tık diye bayıldır.
While it's not ideal, we are trying to push things to the extreme here, so it's a compromise I'm willing to make. In order to prepare for this, I need to solder some really thick wire to the PS5's power input to reduce the voltage drop down its length, and routing it around to exit between the barbed connectors allows me to hide it between the two lengths of rubber tubing that will carry water to and from the cooling block. This stuff is a bit thicker than I'd like, but at least it's nice and robust, and to match it aesthetically with the rest of the build, I thought it would be cool to sheathe it with some copper braiding, which also provides grounding to the chassis. So with that done, we're ready to add the lid. Earlier I used the cooling block as a template for making this, using the last bits of copper and soldering them together, which ended up looking pretty neat. While I am going for a minimal look here, I do need to make some holes for the USB ports, and also for a power button. As I want to make this power button also act as a power light indicator, we can take the PS5's original lighting strip board and glue a brass tube over its LEDs with some epoxy. The LEDs should light up this epoxy, which will be visible through the tube, but we'll have to wait until later to see
Bak
how
bak
well this
toparlayamayız
works.
abi ne yazık ki. Değil mi?
As the
PC
LED
toplamıyorum
board
yayında
itself
artık.
doesn't actually feature a button of
Toplayamıyorum.
any
Ama
kind,
PC toplamadıysan
some
sen
glue can
toplarsan
be used
topladıktan
at the
sonra ben
other end
bakabilirim.
to anchor it, so that when pressed it can trigger a little
PC
push
toplayamıyorum
button
arkadaşlar.
mounted
F5
behind it
attığımda
like
ürünün
so.
fiyatı değişiyor.
This push button in turn is wired up to the original power button and will thus trigger the PS5 to turn on or off when pressed. As I earlier soldered some brass pillars to the internal corners of this cover, it can be screwed in place from underneath, with some rubber pads providing some
Büyük
fitting
ihtimal
as
ama
well.
dediğimiz gibi olacak. Yani bütün her şey iletken. Her şey, bütün kasa dev bir ısı iletkeni. Yüzey olarak bu arada genişliyor, evet. Yüzey olarak yani her şey iletken olduğu için ısı çok daha homojen bir şekilde dağılacak ama yetmeyecek bence.
The rear side, it has its own special cover. And to make the tubing look a bit neater, I've used my trusty prusa to print off a few plastic brackets to clip it at various points, essentially turning it into a tether. Despite being fairly bulky, it's not really that noticeable when the unit is in position,
güzelmiş.
especially as, like most set-top devices, it will have other cables like HDMI going into the back of it anyway.
Hoş oldu bu arada
Either
bence.
way, it looks great in my book, and the polished copper provides a unique, refreshing aesthetic. The best bit, of course, is that it measures just 1.9
Baksana ne kadar
centimeters.
küçüldü yani.
I've actually beaten my 2 centimeter goal, and it's now a fraction of the thickness of the original. Crazy. Before we can turn it on though and
Diğeri
test
gel,
out whether the
selamun
cooling
aleyküm.
block performs well enough to keep the system cool during use, I do still need to sort out a power supply, which, as you know, is inspired by previous PS5 Slim releases. The only difference with mine is that it's going to have to handle cooling as well, which makes things challenging but also very interesting. But before we get on with that, one thing you'll notice with this build is that it's taken a lot of time and effort even just to get to this
Tabii.
point.
Evet.
And even though most
Sponsor.
of you used hand tools, I doubt that many of you are going to put the time and energy into copying what I've done here. But that's okay, because making your PS5 slimmer and cooler isn't actually as hard as all this, which leads me neatly onto a quick ad from the sponsor of this video, Dbrand, who make what they call Dark Plates 2.0, which are replacement PS5 side panels
Ya bu
with some
çok güzel
awesome
ya.
features. The most apparent being that they have a built-in vent which improves airflow to the fan,
Bu çok güzel
resulting
bu
in
arada.
effective cooling. Mounting them is
Ben
as
bunu
simple
alacağım
as
büyük
clipping
ihtimalle.
them in place. And as you can see, they give the PS5 a completely different
Baksana ne
aesthetic
kadar
thanks
daha
to
güzel
their
duruyor
new
ya.
shape. I'll be honest, the PS5's original protruding collar has grown a bit old in my book, so it's great to have a smarter alternative, especially as they're available in different tones. Now, I'd imagine that redesigning these panels from the ground up was a huge challenge, but Dbrand's efforts have certainly paid off because the quality is just as good as the originals and they fit
Çok güzel duruyor
perfectly.
abi.
Now, if you want even more customization
Adamların arasında
options,
kapak satıyor. Evet. Oğlum Dbrand zaten şey sticker firması genellikle. iPhone'a, MacBook'a bilmem ne hani kaplama satıyorlar. Ama yani bu kapak şey ucuz bir şey değil.
Dbrand's got you covered there as well, as they've got a variety of high-quality vinyl skins that can be used to easily
Aynen, bak,
change the
normalde bunları
appearance
satıyorlar.
and texture of the central glossy plastic. And they have the added benefit of being
Alda
much
doğum,
more
Alda doğum,
resistant to
Türkçe bu arada
fingerprints
20.
and
yaşın canımsın.
scratches,
En iyi haber
something
Sam,
the
hoş
original
geldin.
gloss finish was very susceptible to. And their cool light filters are something else entirely.
Sormuş.
So visit dbrand.com/DIY dark plates if you'd like to customize your PS5 to put your own style to it. And don't forget that Dbrand offers skins for all sorts of other devices too, for you to make them your own. So thank you Dbrand for sponsoring this video. And let's
Pepesi
get back
arttı
to the
cidden.
project. So with these
İnan
tethers now
çok bu arada
added,
13.
I
yaşın
need to make
canımsın. En iyi
a
haber
power
Sam,
brick
hoş
that can
geldin.
not only provide power for the PS5, but also cool it as well. Now, in terms of power, the power brick
Evet,
that
bunun
was
için kablama
originally
satıyor, kaliteli
inside
midir
the
sence?
PS5
Yok.
is not only a super
Bir
weird shape,
Dbrand değil ne
but
yazık
it
ki.
doesn't feature its own
AliExpress'tekiler.
fan, instead being designed to
Yani
rely
güzeller
on the
vardır
console's
ama bir
own
Dbrand kalitesinde
airflow
yoktur
to
büyük
keep itself
ihtimalle.
cool. Strapping a fan onto it to keep it cool
Nokta,
just looks
hadi bakalım.
stupid, so ideally I'd like to get rid of it and use something else entirely. Taking a close look at its specs, we can see that it outputs 31 amps at 12 volts, and thankfully it appears to present this voltage without being connected up to the PS5. So, in theory, we can indeed swap it out with any sufficiently powerful 12-volt alternative. I have this much more sensibly shaped computer power supply on
Evet
hand.
saçma. Niye saçma oğlum?
And
Mis
to make it
işte.
prettier, I've made a case out of
server şeyi
aluminium
almış.
to go around it. Though you might be wondering why it's so long. Well, that's to make room for the cooling components, which have been provided for this build by Alpha Cooling.
Laça doğru çok 23 milyarmış. Canımsın. En iyi abonem. Sana hoş geldin. Orijinal power supply'ını bunu kullanması. Oğlum orijinal power supply'ı kullanamıyor ki işte.
Set of water pumps to circulate the water, it can be fitted to the casing alongside.
Orijinal power supply soğutması lazım. Sıkıntı o.
Power supply and be linked up to the PS5's new tubing. Now, as is normal for water cooling loops, it needs a special type of coolant, and I'm using a temporary reservoir to make filling it a bit easier. As the copper of the main PS5 body and the aluminium casing of this power/cooling unit both block Wi-Fi signals, I've extended the antennas down to be glued to the exterior of this for an unobstructed signal. While it's not the prettiest thing in the world, it actually won't ever be seen, as the idea is for it to mount to the wall behind a TV. And with that, the unit is complete and we're ready.
Bazukayı aldı gidiyor. Bum.
Now it would be
Ama
a
kurula
little
daha
bit
bit olmadı. Ya oğlum zaten proje arkadaşlar zaten PlayStation 5'in gerçek silimini yapmak değil. Adam elinde sonunda AMD'den yeni çip almıyor, bir şey yapmıyor. Tabii ki de daha küçük yapamayacak. Olay daha küçük yapmak, yani fiziksel olarak daha küçük yapmak.
understatement to say that I'm nervous because I've worked on this for a couple of months and let's...
Çalışmayacak çünkü diski takmayı unuttu. Bu arada. Disk olmadan çalışmıyor PlayStation.
Hope it works.
Dijital versiyonunu almadı.
Come on. Okay, so 12 volts is being supplied to it as expected. But there is one thing that I'm hoping is the cause, which is simply that the fan isn't.
Ha evet, fanı da takman gerekiyor. Doğru diye biliyorum. Fan da onlardan birisi. Ama fandan emin değilim. Ben disk diye biliyorum. Çünkü nasıl disk olmadan çalışmıyor?
Where the power lead goes in here, I just bridged the connection, so that's great because that's not that hard to fix.
Tamam, şey yanlış yapmış. Power düğmesini yanlış yapmış.
Working. So what I've done is basically just bypass the original power button and its little strip and just solder it straight onto the motherboard. And it's working, which is great.
Demek ki dijital only versiyonu yapmış.
Hey!
Damn.
That little beep of triumph. There we go. That's a relief.
Çok güzel yaptım orada. Bana çok güzel gözüküyor.
Obviously great, but the whole point of this thing was to obviously make it thin, but it needs to perform just as well as
diskli versiyonuna benziyordu. Ben diskli versiyonda disksiz çalışmıyor diye biliyorum ama emin değilim.
Turns on. Step 2, need to make sure it actually
Şeyde izlemiştim, TikTok'ta izlemiştim. Adam diski değiştiriyordu, patlıyordu. O normal error.
Little did I know that things were about to go horribly wrong.
Oh no.
That's not good.
Çok ısındı.
Feels okay. Whoa.
Ne oldu?
This isn't where this is going to be permanently fitted, so I had it propped up on this and it had fallen over, blocking the intake, which is on the bottom here, so there was no airflow, and the PS5 presumably overheated, so let's hope it's not done any damage. Come on, I'm just fed up.
Oh no, yandı.
We've got another problem, a bigger one this time. It's now not turning on. So the light comes on and then it just goes off and there's nothing I can do to change it. And to have made such a stupid mistake right at the project's completion, killing the PS5 stone dead, is devastating. So I am incredibly disappointed, but I'm not going to give up because D-Brand actually sent over a spare PS5 to use for the B-roll for their sponsor spot, and I am going to borrow the motherboard from this to
Never
hopefully
give
get
up.
the system running again.
Ulan adam
So,
D-Brand'in
sorry,
sponsor
D-Brand,
şeylerinde
if you're
yok
wondering where
dedi.
your PS5 is, well, here's your answer why you've not received it back yet. Anyway, the process of transplanting the motherboard isn't terribly difficult, but this time I'm including a few thermal probes so we can monitor the PS5's temperatures at various points to make sure it's all working within spec. So, with the cooling unit mounted more securely this time, it's the moment of truth. Light. Come on. Yes! Oh,
Oyun oynuyorsam.
thank you, D-Brand. At last. Woo! Now, before I do anything else, I'm going to test out the temperatures on this thing so we can hopefully avoid a reshoot of what happened earlier. So, I'm going to run Horizon Forbidden West, which is a new title, and it should push the
Harbiden yeni
PS5 to its
şey.
limits. But I'm going to be monitoring the thermal.
PlayStation bozulacak kadar ısınmaya devam ediyor yani kapatmıyorum kendimi noktada. Orijinal parçaları olsa o noktaya ulaşmıyor zaten. Sıkıntı şu. Orijinal parçaları yok.
Through my thermal probes, so let's hope it goes well. After leaving the game running for several hours, the first news is that it hasn't frozen this time, and checking out the temperatures we can start to see why. The main processor probe reports a maximum temperature of just 46
45
Celsius.
çok iyi bu arada.
As the probe isn't actually inside the silicon though, my best guess is that it's somewhere around 65 degrees internally.
Evet büyük ihtimalle.
Still a good result.
İyi bu arada
What about the memory?
65.
This one should be fairly accurate as the probe has been embedded within the heat spreader itself, and we get a result of 52 degrees here.
Kötü değil.
The VRMs
Not
are
bad.
even cooler at 44 degrees, indicating that the heat
VRM de
pipe is
çok iyi.
doing its job. Yay! So great results, but how do they compare to the original untouched PS5? Well, I positioned my thermal probes as closely as possible to how the guys over at Gamers Nexus mounted theirs when they were doing a
Yakından
detailed
daha iyi bu arada
analysis of
performans.
the console. And there are some
Tabii
interesting
Novak'i zaten
findings here.
kardeşi Xbox'ta
Their
çıkmış bir
processor
şey.
measurement hit 75 Celsius, though again this was taken from the back, so it wouldn't surprise me if the actual silicon temperature was in the 80 degrees Celsius range at least. As for their RAM measurements, they reported that it hits 94 degrees Celsius, and that it's likely running a bit too
Stomp.
close to its maximum allowable temperature. So the 52 degrees we're getting is really good news, as are the results for the VRMs. The original cooler,
Koymuş.
71 degrees Celsius. The water-cooled PS5, 44 degrees Celsius. Cool. Literally. It's likely that we can get these temperatures even lower as well if we were to use a larger cooler, but that's a video for another time. So there we have it. The world's first PS5
Bak sen
Slim.
çok güzel gözüküyor.
I still can't quite believe just how thin we've managed to make this, and that it works better at keeping the console cool than the original cooler did. Well, that's just an extra cherry on top. Now, of course, we did have a few setbacks, so a massive thank you has to go out to D-Brand for rescuing this project by sacrificing
Bir tane
their own
PlayStation
PS5,
5 çıktı.
although they don't know it
500
yet.
dolar abi,
So
adam
make
için
sure you
çok para
support
değil.
them by maybe buying some
Dünyanın en
dark
çok satan konusunu yapıyor. Soğutacak materyal koyamıyorsun. Koyuyor arkadaşlar. Yani PlayStation 5'iniz çalışıyorsa soğutuyordur. Şimdi sıkıntı şu. Konsollarda siz şunu unutuyorsunuz. Konsol fakir PC'sidir. Türkiye'de bu böyle değil ama yurt dışında böyle. Hani konsol peasant işidir. Yani o yüzden konsol olabildiğince az parayla çok iş yapmak zorunda. O yüzden 500 dolar. Ve o yüzden de kısabildiğin kadar her parçadan kısmaya çalışırsın. Ve yani performansı da maksimize etmeye çalışırsın. Öyle bir şey var. Yani evet, soğutucuyu falan bir de form factor olmak zorunda. Hani belli bir boyutu da aşmamak zorunda ki PlayStation 5'in boyutunu görüyorsunuz. Yani elinde sonunda yapabilecek bir şey yok.
plates for your own PS5 or buying perhaps a skin for your smartphone. And of course, if you want to support this channel
çok abone
directly,
olduğu için
you can do so
canımsın.
at
En iyi abilem, sana hoş geldin.
patreon.com/DIY perks, or maybe buy a cool t-shirt like this one. DIY Perks fan. But other than that, I'm Matt. You've been watching DIY Perks.
Yakında PC toplama gibi konsol toplama gelir. Gelmez.
and I hope to see you next time.
Yak.
Goodbye for now.
Ya, direkt yok. PC yani konsol toplaması derdi olmadığı için konsol zaten arkadaşlar. Ama daha fazla seçenekli hale gelebilir. Zaten var. Series S, Series X. İki tercih. Grafikler sikimde değil, sadece FIFA oynuyorum diyorsan Series S alıyorsun. Ben jenerasyon en iyi grafiklerini almak istiyorum. Series X alıyorsun. Bu. Veya 200 sene sonra Pro modeli çıkacak PlayStation'ın. En güncel modelini istiyorsan Pro olacaksın. Büyük ihtimal Slim modeli çıkacak o dönemde. Ya da PlayStation 5 Slim alacaksın. Yani olay bu.